The blood on Clara Garrison's hands had dried 3 days ago, but she still saw it every time she closed her eyes, still felt the weight of the gun that had changed everything about who she was and who she could ever be again. She pressed herself deeper into the cave's shadows as the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the New Mexico canyon below, her breath catching in her throat the way it had every time she heard riders pass by since she'd fled Albuquerque. The November wind of 1882 cut through her torn dress, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to preserve what little warmth remained in her body. 3 days without food, with only the trickle of water from the back of the cave to keep her alive, and Clara knew she couldn't last much longer. But going back meant facing what she'd done, meant the rope and the judgment of people who would never understand that sometimes killing a man was the only way to stay alive yourself. The hoofbeats grew closer, and Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd chosen this cave precisely because it was hidden, tucked into a cliff face that couldn't be seen from the main trail, accessible only by a narrow ledge that most riders would never notice. Yet someone was coming closer, the sound of the horse's gait changing as the rider slowed. Clara's fingers closed around a rock, the only weapon she had left. She'd thrown the gun into the Rio Grande as she fled, watching it sink into the muddy water and wishing her memories could disappear just as easily. "Easy now," a man's voice drifted up from below, calm and low, speaking to his horse rather than to any person. "I know you smell water, boy. Let me just see where it's coming from." Clara held her breath. The voice didn't sound like a lawman or a bounty hunter. It sounded tired, lonely even, but she'd learned that voices could lie as easily as words. She remained perfectly still, hoping the approaching dusk would hide her if the rider happened to glance up at the cave entrance. The sound of boots on stone made her press back harder against the cave wall. He was climbing. Somehow, impossibly, he'd found the narrow path that led up to her hiding place. Clara raised the rock, her hand trembling from weakness and fear. She wouldn't go back. She couldn't. Whatever happened now, she'd fight until her last breath. A hat appeared first, battered and dust-covered, followed by broad shoulders and a weathered face that looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most. The man pulled himself up onto the ledge and froze when he saw her, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip. But then his eyes took in her condition, her torn dress, her hollow cheeks, the desperate way she clutched that pathetic stone as though it could protect her from anything, and his hand moved away from the weapon. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, raising both hands slowly. "My name is Robert Hawthorne. I own a ranch about 5 miles east of here. I was just looking for the water source my horse smelled." Clara didn't lower the rock. Her voice came out as a rasp, rough from disuse and thirst. "Go away." Robert Hawthorne didn't move. His eyes, she noticed even in her fear, were a warm brown, the kind that crinkled at the corners as though he'd spent years squinting into the sun. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble and lips that looked like they'd forgotten how to smile. Everything about him spoke of hard work and loneliness, from his worn clothing to the way he stood as though he'd forgotten anyone might be watching. "You're hurt," he said, his gaze moving to her hands. "And you haven't eaten in days unless I miss my guess. Whatever you're running from, you won't survive much longer up here." "Better than the alternative," Clara said, but even as she spoke, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The cave tilted, and she grabbed at the wall to steady herself, the rock falling from her nerveless fingers. Robert moved quickly, catching her before she hit the ground. His arms were strong and steady, and for just a moment, Clara let herself lean into that strength before her survival instinct kicked back in. She struggled weakly, trying to push away from him. "Stop," he said, not unkindly. "You're going to hurt yourself more. Just let me help you down to my horse. You need food and water, and whatever trouble you're in, dying in a cave isn't going to solve it." "You don't understand," Clara whispered, but she had no strength left to fight. Her body had betrayed her, using up the last of its reserves in that moment of panic. "They'll hang me." Robert was quiet for a moment, his arms still supporting her weight. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Did you kill someone who deserved it?" The question was so unexpected, so different from what she'd imagined anyone would ask, that Clara found herself answering honestly. "Yes." "Then we'll figure something out," Robert said. "But first, let's get you somewhere warm. Can you walk?" Clara tried to stand on her own and immediately stumbled. Without another word, Robert scooped her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing. She should have protested, should have fought, but the combination of exhaustion and the unexpected gentleness in his touch made resistance impossible. He carried her carefully down the narrow path, moving with the sure-footedness of someone who'd spent his life navigating rough terrain. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, waited patiently at the bottom. Robert settled Clara into the saddle, then swung up behind her, one arm wrapping around her waist to keep her steady. She could feel the warmth of his body against her back, smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes, and for the first time in 3 days, she felt something other than terror. It was a dangerous feeling, this momentary sense of safety, but Clara was too tired to fight it. They rode through the gathering darkness, and Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, barely aware of the landscape passing by. She registered the moment they turned onto a property, the creak of a gate opening, and then they were in a yard surrounded by various outbuildings. A modest ranch house stood at the center, weathered wood that had seen many seasons but was clearly well maintained. Robert dismounted and lifted Clara down, carrying her into the house. The interior was sparse but clean, furnished with simple, sturdy furniture that matched its owner. He took her to a bedroom and laid her gently on the bed, then disappeared, returning moments later with a cup of water and some bread. "Slowly," he cautioned as she reached for the water with shaking hands. "You'll make yourself sick if you drink too fast." Clara forced herself to take small sips, though everything in her wanted to gulp the water down. The bread was harder to manage. Her stomach had been empty so long that even those small bites felt like too much, but she knew she needed the food. Robert watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "When you're feeling a bit stronger, there's a wash basin and some clean clothes in the corner," he said, gesturing to a simple cotton dress hanging on a peg. "They belong to my sister. She's about your size. Take your time. I'll be in the other room when you're ready to talk." He left before Clara could respond, closing the door quietly behind him. She stared at the closed door for a long moment, trying to understand why this stranger was helping her, what he might want in return. In her experience, nobody did anything without expecting something back. But the immediate need to wash away 3 days of dirt and fear overwhelmed her suspicion. The water in the basin was cold, but Clara didn't care. She stripped off her ruined dress, scrubbing at her skin until it was raw, trying to wash away not just the physical grime but the memory of that night. The blood had been mostly on her hands and dress, had sprayed across her face when she'd pulled the trigger at close range. She'd killed Thomas Mercer, the man who'd owned the saloon where she worked, the man who'd decided that paying her wages gave him the right to do whatever he wanted to her body. She'd told him no. She'd fought. And when he'd pinned her down, his hands around her throat, she'd grabbed the gun he'd carelessly left on the desk and she'd shot him. Self-defense, surely. But Thomas Mercer had been a wealthy man with connections throughout Albuquerque, and Clara had been just a saloon girl, a woman with no family and no one to speak for her. She'd known immediately that no court would take her word over his reputation. So she'd run, still wearing the dress covered in his blood, and she'd kept running until her legs gave out and the cave had offered temporary sanctuary. Clara pulled on the clean dress Robert had provided. It was simple and a bit worn, but it fit reasonably well and felt like heaven against her scrubbed skin. She ran her fingers through her tangled brown hair, trying to work out the worst of the knots, and caught a glimpse of herself in a small mirror hanging on the wall. She looked like a ghost, her face gaunt and pale, her green eyes too large in her thin face, but at least she looked human again. Taking a deep breath, Clara opened the door and stepped into the main room of the house. Robert sat at a rough-hewn table, 2 plates of food laid out. The smell of beans and cornbread made her stomach growl audibly. He looked up at her entrance and gestured to the empty chair. "Sit. Eat. Then we'll talk." Clara sat, and this time she managed to eat more, forcing herself to go slowly despite her hunger. Robert ate his own food in silence, not pressing her, just letting her take her time. It was only when both plates were clean that he finally spoke. "You said they'd hang you," he said, his voice matter of fact. "But you also said the man you killed deserved it. I'd like to hear the whole story if you're willing to tell it, and I'd like the truth." Clara's hands clenched in her lap. She'd spent 3 days imagining this conversation, imagining someone demanding answers, but somehow the reality was different. Robert's tone wasn't accusatory. It was simply direct, the tone of a man who wanted information so he could make an informed decision. She owed him that much at least, so she told him. Everything. About working in Thomas Mercer's saloon because it was the only job available after her father died and left her with nothing. About how Mercer had watched her with hungry eyes, how he'd made comments that became progressively more explicit, how his casual touches had become gropes. About how she tried to quit and he'd laughed, telling her she owed him money for room and board, trapping her with debts she couldn't repay. And finally, about that last night when he'd called her to his office after closing and locked the door behind her. "I told him no," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I fought him, but he was so much stronger. He pushed me down on his desk and started tearing at my clothes. His hands were around my throat, squeezing, and I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die. Then I saw his gun and I grabbed it and I shot him." Her hands were shaking, remembering the weight of the gun, the deafening sound of the shot, the way Mercer's eyes had widened in shock before the light left them. "He died quickly. I didn't even wait to see if anyone had heard. I just ran. I knew no one would believe me. Who takes the word of a saloon girl over a respected businessman?" Robert was quiet for a long moment after she finished. His eyes had never left her face during the story, and she'd seen his jaw clench when she described Mercer's attack, seen his hands curl into fists on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed anger. "You did what you had to do to survive. That's not murder, that's self-defense." "The law won't see it that way," Clara said bitterly. "I worked in a saloon. That makes me a certain kind of woman in most people's eyes, never mind that I only served drinks. And Mercer was rich. Rich men don't assault women according to society. They just exercise their rights over those beneath them." "That's not right," Robert said flatly. "And I won't pretend otherwise. But you're right that the law probably won't be on your side, not in Albuquerque anyway, not with Mercer's connections." He was quiet again, thinking, and Clara waited, her heart sinking. He was going to turn her in. Of course he was. She'd been foolish to tell him the truth, but Robert surprised her. "You can stay here," he said. "At least until we figure out what to do. I don't get visitors out here very often. I keep to myself, and most folks respect that. You'll be safe while you recover your strength." Clara stared at him. "Why would you help me? You don't know me. I could be lying about everything." "You could be," Robert agreed. "But I don't think you are. I've seen enough of life to recognize truth when I hear it. And even if I'm wrong, I can't in good conscience turn a starving woman over to a hanging. My mother raised me better than that." "Where is your mother?" Clara asked, glancing around the empty house. Something shuddered in Robert's expression. "Dead. 4 years now. Fever took her quick. My father died 2 years before that, trampled by a spooked horse. My sister married a man from Santa Fe and moved there last year. So now it's just me and the ranch." The loneliness in his voice was palpable, and Clara understood it because she felt it too. They were both alone, both haunted by their pasts, both trying to survive in a harsh world that didn't care much about people like them. Maybe that was why he was helping her. Maybe he simply recognized a fellow survivor. "I can work," Clara said. "If I'm going to stay, I should earn my keep." "I'm not afraid of hard work." "We'll see about that once you've gotten your strength back," Robert said. "For now, you should rest. Take the bedroom. I'll sleep out here." "I can't take your bed," Clara protested. "You can and you will," Robert said, his tone brooking no argument. "You've been sleeping on cave stone for 3 days. You need a real bed more than I do. Now go on. You look like you're about to fall over." He was right. The food and warmth had made her realize just how exhausted she truly was. Clara stood, swaying slightly, and Robert rose quickly to steady her with a hand on her elbow. The touch was brief and impersonal, but Clara felt it all the way through her body, a reminder that not all touch meant violence, that gentleness still existed in the world. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes. "I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you." "Get some rest, Clara," Robert said softly. It was the first time he'd used her name, and somehow that simple familiarity felt like a promise. Clara made her way back to the bedroom and collapsed onto the bed, asleep almost before her head hit the pillow. She slept deeply and dreamlessly, her body finally able to relax in the safety of 4 walls and a locked door. Over the next few days, Clara slowly regained her strength. Robert was a quiet presence, going about his ranch work during the day and returning in the evenings to cook simple meals that they ate together in companionable silence. He asked no more questions about her past, and she asked none about his, both of them seeming to understand that some wounds were too fresh to probe. On the 4th day, Clara felt strong enough to insist on helping with the work. Robert hesitated, clearly not wanting to push her too hard, but eventually agreed to let her handle some of the lighter chores. She started with the chickens, collecting eggs and feeding them, then moved on to helping prepare meals and cleaning the house. It felt good to be useful, to have purpose again beyond simply hiding and surviving. She discovered that Robert raised cattle, though his herd was small. He worked the ranch alone, doing the work of 3 men, and Clara could see the toll it took on him. He was strong and capable, but there was a weariness in his movements at the end of each day that spoke of years of shouldering burdens alone. She found herself wanting to ease that burden, to give back some of what he'd given her. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the New Mexico landscape, Clara finally broke the comfortable silence. "Why are you alone out here, Robert? A man like you should have a wife, a family." Robert took a long time to answer, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I was engaged once," he said finally. "Her name was Margaret. We were planning to marry, build a life here together. But then she met a banker from Albuquerque, a man who could give her a fine house in town, nice dresses, a life of comfort. She chose him instead. Can't say I blame her. Ranch life is hard, especially for women. I couldn't offer her much beyond long days of work and uncertain futures. She was a fool, Clara said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. Comfort means nothing without integrity. You're worth a dozen bankers. Robert turned to look at her, something warm and surprised in his expression. That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness. It's truth. You took in a stranger, a fugitive, and asked for nothing in return. You've treated me with more respect and decency than men who claim to be pillars of the community. That means something. That means everything. They looked at each other in the fading light, and Clara felt something shift between them. It was subtle, just a gentle awareness, but it was there. She found herself noticing things about Robert she hadn't let herself see before. The way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the strength in his hands as he worked, the kindness in his eyes that he tried to hide behind gruff practicality. He was a good man, maybe the only truly good man she'd ever known, and she was starting to care about him in ways that went beyond gratitude. The realization terrified her. She had no right to care about anyone, not when she was living on borrowed time, not when every day brought the risk that someone from Albuquerque would ride up looking for the woman who'd killed Thomas Mercer. Getting close to Robert would only bring him trouble, would only hurt him when she inevitably had to run again. But her heart, it seemed, didn't care about logic. As November gave way to December, Clara's feelings deepened despite her best efforts to maintain distance. She couldn't help it. Every small kindness Robert showed her, every moment of quiet companionship, every rare smile that transformed his serious face into something beautiful chipped away at her defenses. She found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, memorizing the details of him, storing them away like treasures. And she thought maybe, just maybe, he was feeling something too. She caught him watching her sometimes, his expression soft and wondering as though he couldn't quite believe she was real. His touches, always respectful and brief, seemed to linger a little longer. When they talked in the evenings, he leaned closer, as though drawn to her despite himself. Neither of them spoke of it, both too cautious, too aware of the complications, but it was there between them, growing stronger with each passing day. One cold December morning, Clara was in the barn collecting eggs when she heard horses approaching. Her heart seized in her chest, and she dropped the basket, eggs shattering at her feet. Through a gap in the barn wall, she saw 3 riders coming up the road to the ranch. They wore the stars of lawmen, and Clara felt the blood drain from her face. They'd found her. She looked around frantically for a place to hide, but before she could move, Robert appeared in the barn doorway. He must have seen the riders too. His face was calm but serious, and he spoke quickly and quietly. "Stay here. Don't make a sound. Let me handle this." "Robert, they'll arrest you for harboring me," Clara whispered urgently. "They won't if they don't find you. Trust me, Clara." He left before she could argue, striding out to meet the lawmen. Clara pressed herself into the shadows of the barn, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Through the gap, she could see Robert greeting the men, his posture relaxed and unconcerned. "Morning, gentlemen." His voice carried clearly in the cold air. "What brings you out this way?" The lead lawman, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, tipped his hat. "Morning, Hawthorne. We're looking for a woman, Clara Garrison. She's wanted for the murder of Thomas Mercer in Albuquerque. Last anyone saw, she was headed this direction." "You seen any strangers around here lately?" "Can't say I have," Robert replied, his tone easy. "But I don't get many visitors out here." "When did this happen?" 3 weeks ago. Woman shot Mercer in cold blood, they say, worked in his saloon, probably thought she could rob him or some such thing." The lawman spat on the ground, disgust clear in his voice. "Course, Mercer's wife is offering a reward for her capture, $500. Clara closed her eyes, fighting back tears. They were calling it cold-blooded murder. Of course they were. Mercer's wife would want revenge, would make sure the story painted Clara as a villain. The truth didn't matter, it never had. $500, Robert said thoughtfully. That's a considerable sum. Woman must be dangerous. Oh, she is, another lawman chimed in. Killed a respected businessman. Probably been planning it for weeks. You'll let us know if you see anyone suspicious. Of course, Robert said. Always happy to help the law. You boys want some coffee before you head out. It's a cold morning. Appreciate the offer, but we need to keep moving. Got a lot of ground to cover. You have a good day, Hawthorne. Clara watched through the gap as the lawman rode away, not relaxing until they disappeared from view. Even then, she waited, hardly daring to breathe until Robert came back to the barn. When she saw his face, she burst into tears, all the fear and tension of the past weeks finally breaking through. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I should never have stayed. I should have kept running. Now I've made you lie to the law. I've put you in danger. Robert pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried against his chest. You have nothing to apologize for, he said fiercely. I chose to help you, Clara. I chose to lie to those men, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Why? Clara pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her face. Why would you risk so much for me? Robert's hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. His eyes were intense, full of emotion he'd kept carefully hidden until now. Because I'm falling in love with you, he said simply. I know I shouldn't. I know it's foolish and complicated and probably the worst possible timing, but I can't help it. You're brave and strong, and you've survived things that would have broken most people. You light up this house just by being in it. I was alone here, Clara, just going through the motions of living. But you've given me something to care about again, someone to care about. Clara's breath caught. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that loving her was a mistake, that she would only bring him trouble. But looking into his eyes, feeling the tenderness in his touch, she couldn't make the words come, because she loved him too. Impossibly, against all logic and reason, she'd fallen in love with this lonely rancher who'd offered her safety when she had nowhere else to turn. I love you too, she whispered. I've been trying so hard not to, but I do. Robert, I love you so much it scares me. He smiled then, really smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Then he was kissing her, soft and gentle at first, then deeper as she responded, her arms wrapping around his neck. The kiss was everything she'd dreamed of in those quiet moments when she'd let herself imagine what it might be like to be held by him, to be loved by him. It was promise and passion and hope all tangled together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Robert rested his forehead against hers. We'll figure this out, he said. I don't know how yet, but we will. I'm not letting you go, Clara. Not to the law, not to fear, not to anything. They'll keep looking for me, Clara said, though she didn't let go of him. The reward is too high. Someone will eventually recognize me. Then we'll be careful. And if it comes to it, we'll leave. Start over somewhere else. Montana, maybe, or California. I can ranch anywhere. The land doesn't matter, but you do. Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to believe they could have a future together. For the moment, standing in his arms, she let herself hope. The winter months passed quietly. Clara and Robert were careful, always alert for unexpected visitors. She stayed close to the house when Robert was working the ranch, and if anyone did approach, she had hiding places prepared. But mostly, they were left alone. The ranch was remote enough that casual visitors were rare, and the lawman didn't return. During those long winter evenings, Clara and Robert grew closer in every way. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories, their dreams, their fears. Robert told her about growing up on the ranch, about his parents and the hard work that went into keeping a place like this running. Clara told him about her childhood, about her father who'd been a carpenter before the drink took him, about her mother who died when Clara was just 12. They kissed often, sweet, gentle kisses that sometimes deepened into something more passionate, but Robert was always careful, always respectful. He never pushed for more than Clara was ready to give, and that patience made her love him even more. One night in January, as snow fell softly outside and a fire crackled in the hearth, Clara took his hand and led him to the bedroom. She was ready to give herself to him completely, to claim the happiness and intimacy she'd thought forever out of reach. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, Robert taking his time to show her how different it could be when it was with someone you loved, someone who cared about your pleasure as much as their own. It was nothing like the violent assault she'd endured from Mercer. This was beautiful and right, two people joined together by love and choice. Afterward, wrapped in Robert's arms, Clara felt a peace she'd never known before. "Marry me," Robert said into the darkness, his hand stroking her hair. "I know we can't do it officially, not while you're wanted by the law, but marry me anyway. Be my wife in every way that matters." Clara turned to look at him, her heart full to overflowing. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." They spoke their vows to each other the next morning, standing in the ranch house with only God as their witness. There were no official papers, no preacher, but it didn't matter. When Robert slipped a simple silver band onto Clara's finger, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and she placed one of his father's old rings on his hand, they became husband and wife in the ways that truly counted. They belonged to each other, come what may. Spring arrived, bringing warmer weather and new life to the ranch. Clara discovered she was pregnant in early March, and the joy on Robert's face when she told him made her cry happy tears. They would have a child, a family. It seemed like a miracle, this life they were building together despite everything stacked against them, but Clara's happiness was always tinged with fear. She knew the law hadn't forgotten about her. The wanted posters were still out there, and the reward was still offered. She dyed her hair darker, changed the way she styled it, tried to look as different as possible from the woman described in those posters. But she knew it was only a matter of time before their luck ran out. It happened in April, just as the desert was blooming with spring wildflowers. Robert had gone into town to buy supplies, something he did only rarely and with great caution. While he was gone, a stranger rode up to the ranch. Clara saw him coming and hid in their prepared spot in the cellar, but her heart sank when she heard him calling for anyone home. If he decided to search the property, he'd find evidence that someone lived here, evidence that Robert wasn't alone. She waited in the darkness of the cellar for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. Finally, she heard Robert's voice, then the stranger's, and then the sound of horses departing. She didn't emerge until Robert came to get her, and the look on his face told her something was seriously wrong. "He's a bounty hunter," Robert said without preamble. "He's been tracking reports of a woman matching your description in the area. He asked questions in town, and someone mentioned they'd seen smoke from my chimney at odd hours, more smoke than one person would make. He's suspicious." Clara sank onto a stool, her hand instinctively going to her stomach where their child grew. "What do we do?" Robert knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "We leave, tonight. I've been planning for this, saving money. We'll head north, up to Colorado. I have a cousin there who owes me a favor. He'll help us get settled under new names. We can start fresh, Clara. We can be a real family." "You're giving up everything for me," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "Your ranch, your home, everything you've worked for." "This ranch is just land and buildings," Robert said fiercely. "You're my home now, you and our baby. Everything else is just things. Things can be replaced. You can't." They worked through the remaining daylight hours, packing what they could carry, making arrangements for Robert's cattle and horses with a neighboring rancher who asked no questions. As the sun set, they loaded their few possessions onto a sturdy wagon pulled by Robert's two best horses. Clara took one last look at the little ranch house where she'd found safety and love, where she'd been transformed from a frightened fugitive into a woman with hope for the future. "Ready?" Robert asked, offering her his hand. Clara took it, squeezing tightly. "Ready." They traveled through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the bounty hunter. The journey north was long and difficult, especially for Clara in her condition, but Robert was careful, making sure she rested often and ate well. They avoided towns when possible, camping under the stars, living on the supplies they'd brought and the game Robert hunted along the way. During those weeks on the trail, Clara fell even more deeply in love with her husband. He was endlessly patient and gentle, always putting her needs first, making sure she was comfortable and safe. They talked about their future, about the child coming, about the life they would build in Colorado. Robert wanted at least 3 children, he told her one night as they lay under a canopy of stars. Clara laughed and said they should maybe focus on getting through the first one before planning more. They reached Colorado in early May, the mountains still snow-capped and beautiful against the spring sky. Robert's cousin, a man named Daniel who ran a general store in a small town called Ridgeway, welcomed them warmly. He was a few years older than Robert, with the same kind eyes, and he asked no questions about why they needed new names or why Clara seemed so nervous around strangers. "You're safe here," Daniel assured them. "This is a small community, but we look after our own. And anyone Robert vouches for is good enough for me." Daniel helped them file for land under the names Robert Hayes and Catherine Glenn, changing their identities just enough to throw off any pursuit. Robert found work as a ranch hand on a larger spread, while they saved money to buy their own place. Clara, heavily pregnant by now, worked in Daniel's store, helping with bookkeeping and inventory. The town people accepted them without question, and slowly, carefully, Clara began to let herself believe they might actually be safe. Their son was born in August, during a thunderstorm that shook the small cabin they were renting. Robert held Clara's hand through the long labor, never leaving her side, and when the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Clara's arms, they both cried tears of joy. They named him Samuel, after Robert's father, and he was perfect, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Watching Robert with their son made Clara's heart ache with love. He was so gentle, so patient, so completely devoted to this tiny person who'd entered their lives. He would wake in the night to walk with Samuel when the baby fussed, would change diapers without complaint, would spend hours just holding his son and marveling at the miracle of him. This was the father Clara had always hoped for her children, the kind of man who understood that love was shown through actions, not just words. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, Robert and Clara saved every penny they could. 2 years after arriving in Colorado, they had enough to buy a small parcel of land on the outskirts of Ridgeway, just 20 acres, but it was theirs. Robert built them a house, small but sturdy, with a bedroom for them and another for Samuel, and the siblings they hoped he'd have someday. They bought a few head of cattle and some chickens, planted a vegetable garden, and slowly began building the life they dreamed of during those long nights on the trail. Clara had never been happier. Her past felt like a distant nightmare, something that had happened to a different person in a different lifetime. She was Catherine now, Robert's wife, Samuel's mother, a respected member of the Ridgeway community. She helped at church socials, traded preserves with the other ranch wives, taught Sunday school. This was the life she'd always wanted, the life that had seemed impossible when she'd been hiding in that cave. But the past had a way of catching up, no matter how far you ran. It happened on a warm September afternoon when Samuel was 3 years old. Clara was in town with her son, buying supplies at Daniel's store, when a man walked in. He was dusty from travel, wearing the clothes of someone who'd been on the road for a long time. Clara didn't recognize him at first, but something about him made her nervous. She tried to finish her shopping quickly, but before she could leave, the man's eyes landed on her. She saw the moment recognition hit. His eyes widened, and he took a step toward her, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Clara Garrison," he said, and the name she hadn't used in years fell like a stone in the quiet store. "I've been looking for you for 3 years." Clara instinctively pulled Samuel behind her, her heart racing. She saw Daniel reach for something under his counter, probably a gun, and several of the townspeople who'd been browsing turned to stare. Time seemed to slow down as Clara tried to think, to plan, to find a way out of this. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, keeping her voice steady. "My name is Catherine Hayes." The bounty hunter laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Maybe that's what you call yourself now, but I never forget a face. You're Clara Garrison, wanted for the murder of Thomas Mercer in Albuquerque. There's still $500 on your head." "That's quite an accusation," Daniel said coldly. "This is Catherine Hayes. She's been a resident of this town for 3 years. I think you have the wrong person." "I don't," the bounty hunter insisted, "and I'm taking her back to face justice." "You're not taking her anywhere," a voice said from the doorway, and Clara's heart leaped. Robert stood there, his face hard as granite, his hand resting on his own gun. He must have seen the bounty hunter ride into town, must have come running. "That's my wife you're threatening." The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed. "So you're the one who's been hiding her. That makes you an accomplice. You could hang too." "I'd like to see you try," Robert said, his voice deadly calm. "You're alone and outnumbered. Everyone in this store would testify that you drew on an unarmed woman and child. How do you think that would look?" Clara could see the bounty hunter calculating his odds, looking around at the hostile faces of the townspeople who'd grown to know and care for Catherine Hayes. These people didn't know about her past, but they knew her present, knew she was a good woman, a loving mother, an honest neighbor. They'd already chosen their side. "The reward still stands," the bounty hunter said, but he was backing toward the door. "I'll be back with the law." "You do that," Daniel said. "And we'll tell them about a man who came into my store making wild accusations and threatening a woman and child. Threatening my cousin's wife, as it happens. See how that goes for you." The bounty hunter left, but everyone knew he'd be back. Robert took Clara and Samuel home immediately, and that night they held a council with Daniel and several of their closest neighbors. Clara told them everything, the whole truth, holding nothing back. She talked about Thomas Mercer's assault, about shooting him to save her own life, about running to New Mexico and hiding in a cave until Robert found her. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then Mary Thornton, one of the older women in the community, spoke up. "So you defended yourself against a man who tried to force himself on you?" "Yes," Clara said quietly. "Then you did nothing wrong," Mary said firmly. "Nothing at all. That bounty hunter has no business here, and neither does any law that says a woman has to accept being violated." The others nodded in agreement, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes at this acceptance, this support from people who barely knew her. Over the next few days, the town rallied around her. When the bounty hunter returned with a territorial marshal, he found a wall of resistance. Every person he talked to had the same story. Catherine Hayes had lived in Ridgeway for 3 years. She was a good woman, a devoted wife and mother. She couldn't possibly be this Clara Garrison he was looking for. The marshal, a weary-looking man who seemed tired of chasing ghosts, questioned Clara himself. With Robert and Daniel present, she told him the same story she'd told the townspeople, about defending herself against Thomas Mercer's assault, about running because she knew no one would believe a saloon girl's word against a wealthy man's reputation, about making a new life in Colorado. The marshal was quiet for a long time after she finished. Finally, he sighed. "Miss Garrison, or Mrs. Hayes, or whatever you want to call yourself, I can't say what happened in Albuquerque was right or wrong. I wasn't there, but I'll tell you this. I've spent 20 years in law enforcement, and I've seen enough to know that justice and the law don't always line up neat and tidy. If Thomas Mercer did what you say he did, then you had every right to defend yourself. So you'll arrest her anyway," Robert said bitterly. "I'm saying that I have no proof that Catherine Hayes of Ridgeway, Colorado, is the same person as Clara Garrison of Albuquerque, New Mexico," the marshal said carefully. "The woman described in the wanted poster has brown hair and green eyes. Mrs. Hayes here has dark hair and green eyes. Lots of women fit that description. Without definitive proof, I can't make an arrest. And since everyone in this town vouches for Mrs. Hayes being exactly who she says she is, I have no reason to doubt them." Clara could hardly believe what she was hearing. "You're letting me go." "I'm saying I have no evidence to arrest Catherine Hayes," the marshal repeated. "As for Clara Garrison, well, that case is 3 years old now and the trail is pretty cold. I expect it will eventually be filed away and forgotten, especially now that Thomas Mercer's wife has remarried and moved to Chicago. Sometimes, Mrs. Hayes, justice takes care of itself in unexpected ways." After the marshal left, taking the furious bounty hunter with him, Clara collapsed into Robert's arms, shaking with relief. It was over. Finally, truly over. She could stop looking over her shoulder, stop jumping at every approaching rider, stop fearing the day when her past would tear her away from her family. Life in Ridgeway settled back into a peaceful rhythm after that. Clara, no longer needing to hide her identity, became even more involved in the community. She and Robert's ranch prospered slowly but steadily. 2 years after the incident with the bounty hunter, Clara gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Daniel and Rose. Watching Robert with their 3 children, seeing the joy and love in his face, Clara knew she'd finally found the happiness that had seemed impossible that terrible night she'd fled Albuquerque. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved helping his father with the ranch work. The twins were only 2 years old but already showing distinct personalities. Daniel was quiet and thoughtful like his father, while Rose was bold and adventurous, always getting into mischief. Together, the 5 of them made a family that was loud and chaotic and filled with love. On Samuel's 6th birthday, Clara stood on the porch of their house, watching Robert teach their son how to rope a fence post while the twins played in the yard. The Colorado mountains rose in the distance, majestic and enduring, and Clara thought about how far she'd come from that desperate woman hiding in a cave. She'd been so certain that her life was over that night she killed Thomas Mercer, so convinced that there was no future for someone like her. But Robert had offered her tomorrow. He'd given her safety when she was hunted, love when she thought herself unlovable, a family when she'd been utterly alone. And in return, she'd given him the same things, had filled his lonely house with laughter and life, had shown him that his heart was big enough to love and be loved. Robert looked up from his work and caught her watching. He smiled, that same smile that had first made her realize she was falling in love with him, and mouthed the words, "I love you," across the distance. Clara smiled back, her heart full. She'd been hiding from her past in a cave, and a lonely rancher had found her and offered tomorrow. But it turned out tomorrow had meant so much more than just another day. It had meant years of tomorrows, a lifetime of love, a family built on trust and devotion, and the courage to believe that even people with broken pasts deserved happy futures. The years continued to pass gently in Ridgeway. Clara and Robert's ranch grew from those initial 20 acres to nearly 100 as they gradually bought neighboring parcels. The cattle herd expanded, and Robert hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work. Clara maintained a large vegetable garden and sold her preserves and baked goods in town, earning money that she carefully saved for their children's futures. Samuel, at 12 years old, was already a skilled horseman and a help to his father in every aspect of ranch work. He had Robert's quiet strength and Clara's quick mind, a combination that served him well. The twins, now 8, were inseparable despite their different personalities. Daniel loved books and learning, often sneaking away from chores to read in the barn loft. Rose, true to her early nature, was fearless, climbing trees and wrestling with the ranch dogs and declaring she'd be a rancher just like her father when she grew up. In 1895, Clara discovered she was pregnant again at 34 years old. It was unexpected but welcomed. Robert was thrilled at the prospect of another child, though he worried about Clara, knowing that childbearing became more difficult as women aged. But Clara was healthy and strong, strengthened by years of good food and hard work, and she sailed through the pregnancy with far less difficulty than she'd experienced with the twins. Their 4th child, a girl they named Grace, was born in early 1896, and she was perfect. She had Clara's dark hair and Robert's brown eyes, and from the moment she arrived, she wrapped her entire family around her tiny finger. Samuel, nearly a teenager, was surprisingly gentle with his baby sister. The twins, now 9, took their roles as older siblings seriously, always wanting to help care for Grace. One evening, as Clara rocked Grace to sleep, while the older children did their homework at the kitchen table, Robert came in from the barn and stood watching his family. Clara caught his expression, something wistful and content all at once, and smiled at him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly, careful not to wake the baby. Robert pulled out a chair and sat, his eyes moving from child to child before settling on Clara. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," he said. "How different my life might have been if I hadn't decided to follow my horse to that water source 7 years ago. I was so lonely, Clara. I'd convinced myself that was just how life was going to be, that I'd work this ranch alone until I died. And then there you were, scared and starving and holding a rock like it was a sword, the bravest thing I'd ever seen." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Even after all these years, Robert could still move her with his words. "I'm the lucky one. You saved my life, Robert. Not just from starvation or the law, but from the belief that I was worthless, that what happened to me was somehow my fault. You showed me that I deserved kindness, that I deserved love. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Robert corrected, reaching across the table to take her free hand. "That's what real partnership is. Not one person saving the other, but 2 people choosing to build something together." As Grace grew from baby to toddler, Clara found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this life. She thought about that night in Albuquerque, the night that had seemed to end everything. She'd killed a man, and she would carry that weight forever, even though she knew she'd had no choice. But she'd also learned that one terrible moment didn't have to define an entire life, that redemption was possible, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. The community of Ridgeway had become truly home. Clara had deep friendships with the other women in town, relationships built on mutual respect and support. She taught Sunday school alongside Mary Thornton, who'd become like a mother to her. She helped organize barn dances and church socials. She nursed sick neighbors and celebrated births and mourned losses alongside people who'd become family. Sometimes travelers would pass through town with news from New Mexico, and Clara would feel a momentary flutter of old fear. But as the years passed, and no one ever connected Catherine Hayes of Ridgeway with Clara Garrison of Albuquerque, that fear faded to a distant memory. The case had indeed been forgotten, buried under years of other crimes and other priorities, exactly as the marshal had predicted. In 1899, as the new century approached, Robert and Clara celebrated their 7th official wedding anniversary, though it was really their 10th if you counted from the day they'd spoken vows to each other in the New Mexico ranch house. By then, Samuel was 15 and already drawing the attention of several young ladies in town, much to his embarrassment. The twins were 12 and showing the first signs of the young adults they'd become. Grace was 3, a sweet, gentle child who loved animals and flowers and her father's storytelling. They held the anniversary celebration at their ranch, inviting neighbors and friends for a barbecue and dance. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, someone struck up a fiddle and couples began to dance in the yard. Robert bowed formally to Clara, offering his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Hayes?" Clara curtsied, playing along. "You may, Mr. Hayes." They danced as they had at so many gatherings over the years. Robert surprisingly graceful for such a large man, Clara following his lead with ease born of long practice. Around them, their children danced too, Samuel awkwardly partnering with one of the neighbor girls while the twins spun each other in circles and Grace held Daniel's hands as her tiny feet stood on his boots. "Are you happy?" Robert asked as they swayed to the music, his arms secure around her. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Clara answered honestly. "There are moments when I still can't believe this is my life, that I get to have all of this. You, our children, this community, this home. It feels like a dream." "It's real," Robert assured her, pulling her closer. "This is our life, Clara. The life we built together. And we're going to keep building it day by day, year by year, until we're old and gray and watching our grandchildren play in this same yard." Clara laughed, tears of joy streaming down her face. "I love you, Robert Hawthorne, or Robert Hayes, or whoever you want to be, as long as you're mine." "Always yours," Robert promised, and he kissed her there in the firelight while their friends cheered and their children groaned in mock embarrassment, and the stars wheeled overhead in the vast Colorado sky. The years of the new century brought changes and challenges. Samuel grew into a fine young man, and at 18 decided to pursue education, heading to Denver to study agriculture and business. Robert and Clara were proud, even though they missed him terribly. He wrote regularly and came home for holidays, bringing new ideas about ranching practices that he and Robert would discuss for hours. The twins took different paths as they approached adulthood. Daniel discovered a passion for teaching, and at 16 began working as an assistant at the local school. Rose, true to her childhood declaration, stayed on the ranch, working alongside her father and proving herself as capable as any man. She could rope and brand and birth a calf with the best of them, and Robert often said she had more natural ranching instinct than he did. Grace grew into a quiet, artistic child who loved to draw and paint. Clara found her daughter's talent remarkable and encouraged it. ordering art supplies from Denver and displaying Grace's paintings throughout their home. Grace was particularly talented at capturing landscapes, the mountains and meadows of Colorado rendered in careful, loving detail. As Robert and Clara entered their 40s, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch was successful enough that they no longer had to worry about money. Their children were healthy and finding their own paths. Their love, tested by hardship and strengthened by years of partnership, was deeper and richer than ever. One autumn evening in 1905, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Clara rested her head on Robert's shoulder and thought about how much had changed in the 23 years since she'd hidden in that cave. She was 44 now, her hair threaded with silver, her face marked with laugh lines and the weathering of years spent in the sun. Robert was 47, his hair mostly gray, his body still strong but showing the accumulated toll of decades of hard physical labor. But they were happy. Deeply, truly happy in a way that Clara had once thought impossible for people like them. They'd built a life of meaning and purpose, raised children who were good people, created a home filled with love and laughter. The past no longer haunted Clara. She'd made peace with what she'd done, understanding that survival sometimes required hard choices, that defending yourself wasn't murder no matter what the law might say. "You ever regret it?" Clara asked into the comfortable silence. "Helping me that day. Your life would have been simpler if you'd just ridden away." Robert was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously as he always did. "Not for one single second," he finally said. "Simpler maybe, but infinitely emptier. You gave me purpose, Clara. You gave me love and family and reasons to get up in the morning that went beyond just surviving another day. I was alone before you, just going through the motions. You brought me back to life." "We brought each other back to life," Clara corrected, echoing the words he'd once said to her. "That's what love does, I think. It takes broken people and helps them become whole again." As the years continued their steady march, Clara and Robert watched their children grow into adults and begin families of their own. Samuel married a teacher from Denver in 1907 and took over management of the ranch, implementing the modern practices he'd learned in school. Robert was happy to step back from the day-to-day operations, though he still helped when needed and spent hours teaching his grandchildren the skills he'd learned over a lifetime. The twins chose their own paths. Daniel became the headmaster of the Ridgeway School, married a woman from town, and had 3 children who were as bookish as their father. Rose surprised everyone by falling in love with one of the ranch hands, a quiet man from Wyoming who treated her as an equal partner. They built a small house on the edge of the ranch property and ran their own herd of cattle, Rose proving to be just as capable a rancher as her father. Grace, at 16, won a scholarship to study art in San Francisco. It was hard to let her go so far away, but Clara and Robert knew they had to support their daughter's dreams. Grace wrote regularly, her letters full of excitement about her studies and the vibrant art community she'd found. She promised to come home often, and she kept that promise. In 1910, Clara and Robert celebrated their 28th anniversary. They were in their late 40s now, grandparents several times over, respected elders in the Ridgeway community. Daniel organized a party for them at the school, and it seemed like the entire town turned out. There were speeches about Robert and Clara's contributions to the community, about the example their marriage set, about the family they'd raised. Clara listened to the kind words and felt grateful beyond measure. These people knew her as Catherine Hayes, a woman who'd arrived in their town pregnant and scared but determined to build a good life. They knew nothing of Clara Garrison, the fugitive, the woman with blood on her hands. That person felt like someone else entirely, a character from a story Clara had once read rather than someone she'd actually been. But late that night, after the party had ended and they were alone in their bedroom, Clara finally told Robert something she'd never fully articulated before. "I forgive myself," she said quietly, "for killing Thomas Mercer. For years, even though I knew I'd had no choice, even though I understood it was self-defense, I still carried guilt. But I don't anymore. I did what I had to do to survive, and everything good in my life came from that survival. Our marriage, our children, this life we've built. None of it would exist if I'd let Mercer kill me that night. So I forgive myself, and I'm grateful I had the courage to fight back." Robert pulled her close, his arms strong and comforting around her. "I'm grateful too," he said. "For your courage, for your strength, for every choice you made that led you to that cave where I found you. You're the bravest person I've ever known, Clara, then and now." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, bodies that knew each other intimately after decades together, hearts that beat in synchrony. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Clara felt complete peace. She was loved and loving, forgiven and forgiving, whole in a way she'd never been before Robert found her. The years rolled on, bringing joy and sorrow in equal measure as life always does. Daniel's wife died in childbirth in 1912, leaving him a widower with 3 young children. Clara and Robert helped him through his grief, caring for the grandchildren while Daniel found his footing again. Rose and her husband expanded their ranch, becoming quite successful. Samuel and his wife had 2 more children, bringing the total of Robert and Clara's grandchildren to 10. Grace returned from San Francisco in 1914 with a husband, a fellow artist who'd grown up in Montana. They settled in Ridgeway, opening a small gallery and teaching art classes. Clara was thrilled to have all her children nearby again, to see the family she and Robert had created branching out into new generations. In 1915, Clara turned 54. She was a grandmother 10 times over, a respected matriarch of the Ridgeway community, a woman whose advice was sought and whose opinion mattered. When she looked in the mirror, she saw the marks of age but also the marks of a life well lived. Every line on her face had been earned through laughter or worry or love. She wore them proudly. Robert, at 57, was still strong despite increasing complaints about his knees and back. He spent his days now mostly with his grandchildren, teaching them to ride and rope, telling them stories about the old days, passing on the skills and knowledge he'd accumulated over a lifetime. He was beloved by those grandchildren, a figure of steady strength and unconditional love. On warm evenings, Clara and Robert still sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, reflecting on their lives together. They talked about everything and nothing, sometimes in words, sometimes in the comfortable silence of people who knew each other so well that words weren't always necessary. They held hands, those work-worn, age-spotted hands that had built a life together, and they were content. One particular evening in late summer, with the mountains painted gold by the setting sun, Robert turned to Clara with a soft smile. "Do you remember that first night in the ranch house, when I found you in the cave and brought you home?" "Of course," Clara said. "I remember thinking you must be an angel or a fool, taking in a fugitive like that." "I remember thinking you were the bravest thing I'd ever seen," Robert said. "Starving and terrified and still trying to fight. I fell a little bit in love with you that very night, though it took me weeks to admit it to myself." "I was so scared," Clara admitted. "Scared of you, scared of what would happen to me, scared of everything. But you were so gentle, so kind. You made me feel human again, made me remember that not all men were like Thomas Mercer. You saved me in so many ways, Robert." "And you saved me," Robert said. "From loneliness, from a life half-lived, from forgetting what it meant to love and be loved. We saved each other, Clara. That's what makes our story so beautiful." Clara leaned into him, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. "Tell me again," she said softly. "Tell me how you felt when you found me." Robert chuckled, indulging her as he always did. "I came around that rock face and there you were, pressed against the cave wall, holding that little rock like it was a weapon. Your eyes were so green, so full of fear and determination all at once. And I thought, this woman is a fighter. This woman survived something terrible, but she's still fighting. And I knew I had to help you. I couldn't ride away and leave you there. It would have haunted me for the rest of my days." "Best decision you ever made?" Clara asked, knowing the answer but wanting to hear it anyway. "Best decision I ever made," Robert confirmed. "Well, that and marrying you, and having children with you, and building this life with you. All the best decisions I ever made involved you, Clara." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. Two people who'd been broken by life and put back together by love. Their story wasn't the fairy tale kind, where everything was perfect and nothing ever went wrong. It was real and messy and complicated, full of hard choices and difficult moments and shadows that never quite went away. But it was theirs, and it was beautiful, and they'd built it together one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. As the years progressed into the 1920s, Clara and Robert entered their 60s. They were grandparents now to 15 grandchildren, with more on the way. The ranch Samuel ran was prosperous, employing several families from town. Daniel was talking about running for the school board. Rose's cattle operation was one of the most successful in the county. Grace's gallery had become a cultural center for the region, drawing artists from across Colorado. Clara and Robert's own house, the one they'd built all those years ago, had been expanded and renovated several times. It was comfortable now, filled with photographs of children and grandchildren, with Grace's paintings on every wall, with the accumulated treasures of a long life lived well. But their favorite place was still the porch, where they'd spent countless evenings watching the sun set and talking about their day. In the spring of 1923, Clara fell ill. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away, then progressed to weakness and fever. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia and warned that at Clara's age, 62, recovery would be difficult. Robert barely left her side during those terrible weeks, sitting by her bed, reading to her, holding her hand, willing her to get better through sheer force of love. Clara fought the illness with the same determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. She wasn't ready to leave yet, wasn't ready to say goodbye to Robert or their children or the grandchildren she adored. So she fought, and slowly, agonizingly, she began to improve. By early summer, she was back on her feet, thinner and weaker than before, but alive. "You scared me," Robert told her one evening as they sat on the porch together, Clara wrapped in blankets despite the warm air. "I thought I was going to lose you." "Not yet," Clara said, squeezing his hand. "We still have years ahead of us, Robert. I'm not going anywhere." And she was right. Clara recovered fully, regaining her strength through the summer. By fall, she was back to her normal activities, perhaps moving a bit slower but no less determined. She and Robert celebrated their 41st anniversary that year, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and it was a joyous occasion. The 1920s brought many changes to the world. The Great War had ended, the economy was booming, and new technologies were transforming daily life. Ridgway got electricity in 1925, and Clara marveled at having electric lights in their home, no more kerosene lamps to fill and clean. A year later, they got their first telephone, though Robert grumbled about the noise and intrusion. But some things never changed. The love between Clara and Robert remained constant, a bedrock foundation that weathered every storm. They still held hands when they walked. They still kissed goodnight every evening. They still told each other, "I love you," multiple times a day. Their children and grandchildren saw this and understood what real love looked like, the kind that lasted through decades and hardships and the inevitable difficulties of life. In 1928, Clara turned 67 and Robert turned 70. They were old now by any measure, their hair white, their bodies showing the accumulated effects of age and hard work. But their minds were sharp and their hearts were young. They still laughed together, still found joy in simple things, still cherished each moment they had. That year, Ridgway threw them a party celebrating 46 years since they'd arrived in town. Nearly everyone in the community came, including many of the grandchildren they'd influenced over the years through teaching Sunday school and supporting the local school. There were speeches about their contributions, their example, their legacy. Clara and Robert listened, embarrassed by the attention but touched by the love their community showed them. Late in the evening, after most people had gone home and just family remained, Samuel raised his glass for a final toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Who taught me what love really means? Who showed me that strength isn't just about being tough, but about being kind? Who built a family and a legacy that will continue for generations? We love you both more than words can say." "Hear, hear," the others chorused, raising their glasses. Clara wiped tears from her eyes. "We love you all too," she said. "Every single one of you. You're our greatest accomplishment, our greatest joy. Being your parents and grandparents has been the privilege of our lives." As another decade passed, Clara and Robert settled into the comfortable rhythm of elderly life. They moved slower now, couldn't work as hard, needed more rest. But they were together, and that was what mattered. They spent their days reading, walking slowly around the property, visiting with children and grandchildren, and sitting on their porch watching the world go by. In 1932, as the Great Depression gripped the nation, Robert and Clara worried about their children's families. The economy had collapsed, and times were hard for everyone. But the family they'd built proved resilient. They pooled resources, helped each other, and survived through cooperation and love. The ranch provided food and everyone pitched in however they could. They got through it together, the way families do. Clara turned 71 that year, and Robert was 74. They were deeply into old age now, but still they persevered, still they found joy in simple things. A grandchild's visit, a beautiful sunset, a comfortable evening on the porch, each other's company. These were the things that mattered, that gave life meaning. One evening in late 1933, as they sat together watching the stars emerge, Robert turned to Clara. "No regrets?" he asked, a question he'd posed many times over the years. "Not a single one," Clara answered, as she always did. "Well, maybe that I didn't find you sooner. But everything happened as it was meant to, I suppose. I had to go through what I went through to become the person you found in that cave. And you had to be alone long enough to appreciate what we would build together." 51 years, Robert mused. 51 years since I found you. "It's gone by so fast." "And so slowly," Clara added. "Every day has been both endless and over in a blink. That's the strange nature of time, I suppose. But I've cherished every moment, Robert, even the hard ones, because they were moments with you and that made them precious." Robert took her hand, raising it to his lips to kiss her knuckles gently. "You're the love of my life, Clara, the only love of my life. Whatever time we have left, whether it's years or days, I'm grateful for every second." "As am I," Clara whispered. "As am I." They sat together in the darkness, two old people who'd loved each other through hardship and joy, through fear and triumph, through every season of life. Their story had started with violence and fear, with a desperate woman hiding in a cave and a lonely rancher who chose kindness over caution. But it had become something beautiful, something lasting, a testament to the power of love to heal and transform and create meaning. Robert passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1935, at the age of 77. He'd lived a long, full life, had raised children and grandchildren, had built something lasting. Clara, devastated by the loss of her life partner, took comfort in knowing he'd died peacefully, surrounded by family in the home they'd built together. She lived 2 more years after Robert, years filled with the love of her children and grandchildren, years spent remembering and celebrating the life she and Robert had shared. She told their story often, wanting the younger generations to understand what they'd overcome, what they'd built, how love could conquer even the darkest circumstances. Clara died in the summer of 1937, at 76 years old, sitting on her beloved porch watching the sunset over the Colorado mountains. Her children found her there, peaceful and smiling, and they knew she'd gone to be with Robert. They buried her beside him in the Ridgeway Cemetery, under a simple stone that read Robert and Clara Hayes, together forever. But their story didn't end with their deaths. It lived on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the ranch that still operated, in the values they'd instilled, in the love they'd demonstrated every day of their lives together. It lived on in the tale that became family legend, the story of how she'd been hiding from her past in a cave, how the lonely rancher had found her and offered tomorrow, and how that tomorrow had become a lifetime of love. The end.